Welcome back. In today's lesson, we're going to learn about proportion and drawing. We are going to draw our hand, and we're going to look at the proportions of our hand. This is part of our Greek drawing unit. The three things that we're going to focus on in this unit are drawing, proportion, and observation. So first things first, you're going to have a blank piece of paper. On the back of it, I would like you to please write your name at the very bottom. I'm going to write Mr. Lundgren because that's my name. Please write your first name. My first name is Mr. My last name is Lundgren. And then write your section. Let's say this is 7th period on B day. Write that so we have that information there. Now, as we get started in class, we're going to talk about the following things. Number one, we're going to talk about proportion. So, please write down this definition on the back of your paper at the top. Proportion. The relationship of one thing compared to another thing. Okay, and then think of relative size. All right, and I'll pause the video and we'll talk about that concept. But basically, it is all about how the relationship of things are together and how you compare the things to get the correct proportion. Okay, so write that one down. Now that you've written that down, let's talk about our next subject, which is observation. Okay, observation is very important in drawing. Observation is not only looking closely, but questioning and thinking. Okay? Number one, you have to look closely. Looking closely means you're really closely looking at where the lines are, how big something is compared to the other thing. So you have to compare while you're observing. You have to compare everything, one thing to another, the next thing to that thing. Every part you have to compare. And then to compare, you're going to need to look back and forth and change things. Check it out and change things. You're not always going to get it right the first time. When you start drawing, it's going to be wrong a couple times, and you're going to have to erase it, look back and forth, check it out, and change things so that you get things looking right. So finish copying down those two definitions. Good. Now that we've copied down those two definitions, we're going to flip our paper over, and you're going to have a blank sheet. Now, our end goal is something that looks like this. It's kind of a robot hand, and as we go through the process, we're going to talk about the proportions. If you look at your packet that I passed out in class, it has kind of the steps that we're going to go through over on this side. We're going to start with a rectangle. We're going to divide up our rectangle. Then we're going to put our fingers being the appropriate heights. Then we're going to add our thumb, and then I'm going to talk about the different sections and portions of our hand. Okay, so getting started, looking at your hand. Now this is where you need to start closely observing. This piece here, your palm, is mostly a rectangle. If you kind of draw a straight line here, and if I see if I can draw with my pen. Okay, if you think of this rectangle here, and maybe even a pentagon up here with those two flat pieces. As you look at your hand, this rectangle, take your fingers like little calipers and measure this part of your palm. Now this part of your palm is taller than your tallest finger. Most people have the tallest finger being their middle finger. If I put my fingers together like that, you can see my middle finger here is the tallest. It is also the highest on my palm. Whereas your palm curves, the pinky is actually lower on your palm than the middle finger. Now, measure this, and by understanding that your palm is longer than your tallest finger, we're going to get started with a rectangle. I'm going to press fairly hard on my paper, but I would like you to press lightly so that you can erase it when we need to, and just in case you make a mistake. Now, if this is my palm, everyone's beginning rectangle is going to be a little bit different. Some will be bigger, some will be wider, some will be taller. But the point is, if we measure and relate everything together so that we have the proportion correctly drawn, you'll be able to have a reasonable looking hand. Now, like I said, if you measure this piece and you double it up, and I'm going to just draw a line here. Now, this line represents 2 sections of proportion. Now, if I take my hand and I measure where that index finger should, or sorry, middle finger should be, it's just slightly down from that extra length of my palm. Okay, so I'm going to put a little tick mark right about there, just a little bit below that line. Okay, so it looks something like that. Now, before we move on to the other fingers, let's separate the hand out. You'll notice that your hand, although it's not symmetrical because you've got this thumb on the side, which we're not going to talk about yet, but if I take away that thumb, you'll notice that you've got 2 fingers on this side and 2 fingers on this side, right? And it's pretty much divided down the center. So if we take a little tick mark right here, halfway between our hand, you're going to get the halfway mark here on your rectangle. Now, a lot of times when people start drawing hands, they're thinking fingers, but they don't think about that space that's in between the fingers and how all of that goes together. So, first divide this line here in half. Then you'll notice that if we take this half, there's another division line here where those fingers come together. So, from here to here, let's divide that piece in half. Do the best you can to get the line in the middle there, in halfway. Now, look at the other side, and you'll notice that here, there's the space between our fingers. Okay, so I'm going to draw a line halfway between here and here to indicate where the spaces for the fingers would be. Now, if we look closely, this is going to be our middle finger area, this will be our ring finger area, and this will be our pinky, and this will be our index finger. Okay, now, going back to our hand, we notice that this curved piece here is not really a square. Okay, this line of my finger here is about the same height as that line of my finger. So we're going to start at the area of the middle finger, and we're going to curve down a little bit, and then curving down that way to kind of make the curve the natural curve of the palm. Now I'm going to erase the squareness and move my line down just so I kind of keep it in the right place. And then I'm going to erase the squareness on this side and move my line down to the right place. Alright, so those lines are still in the right place. I've still got the right spaces, but now I've got that hand palm area curving. Okay, now we're going to go back to our fingers. Starting with our fingers, you'll notice that this whole, if we look at our middle finger first, our tallest finger, okay, you're going to notice that there's 3 sections, one from here to here and to here. There's a line on each of the areas that bend. If you look at your finger, it's a hinge joint, and it's going to bend right on those creases because there's a bone here, a bone here, and a bone here. And if we divide this space up into thirds, if we take this whole area and we like kind of look at half, and then we try to break it up into even thirds, we can go back with our caliper fingers and say, well, if that's that high, okay, that's exactly right. Good. So we've got like thirds here, and this halfway point we can erase, and now we have thirds. Now in between these thirds, look at the little sections. This is a bone right here. If we were to draw the bones, you have a bone here, and a bone there, right? So if we have those 3 bones, you're going to draw a rectangle around those 3 bones. Now, my first couple classes that did this, a lot of kids made the rectangular section way too thin. They drew it like this, like a little thin, tall rectangle. The rectangle should really go out to these 2 lines here, just shy of those 2 lines. So you want to make sure that your rectangles are not too small, otherwise it's going to end up looking really weird. Okay, now your next rectangle is going to start right above your line, and where we put this line, that's going to be the actual like lines where the joint bends. So here's my next rectangle. Now you'll notice if you look at the rectangles, they get a little bit skinnier at the top. They're not really rectangles, they're more like trapezoids. They kind of get just a little bit thinner at the top each time. Okay, and then my last section here is also quite trapezoidy, but it curves at the top. Okay, so there's my middle finger drawn into the correct proportions so that my finger is a little bit shorter than the length of my palm. Now, look at your hand again, and you're going to see that these 2 fingers, your ring finger and your index finger, all right, these 2 fingers, depending on your own genetics, some will be taller, some people will have a taller index finger, and some people will have a taller middle or a ring finger. If I line a ruler up under here, you'll see that my ring finger is longer than my index finger. So I'm going to start with my ring finger since it's just a little bit shorter, and I'm going to look, it's about that far down. If I kind of compare it to my middle finger, remember we're talking about comparing and looking back and forth to find the proportion. Now if we look at my index finger, it's just a little bit shorter than my ring finger. It lines up about halfway here on the pad of my middle finger. It's about halfway. And if I look down here to my pinky finger, it's about halfway, a little bit higher than halfway in this middle section. So it's a little bit higher than halfway. And I'm going to make a tick mark, oops, too far over, make a tick mark right there. So I've got my ring finger height, I've got my index finger height, and I've got my pinky finger height. Okay, so mark those different heights of your fingers down. Now you're going to take the time to look at the rectangular sections here. If I take my ring off so you can see that rectangular section, you'll see I've got my creases here, creases here, creases here. So if I look, my crease is about that tall, and it's about that tall. And if I take my rectangular section here, my second rectangular section about here, and my third rectangular section that has the curve on top about here. Now this is supposed to start looking like a robot hand. Imagine that I've got the hand of a robot. It's kind of blocky right now, and next time we'll add more contour lines. Okay, so there's my ring finger. Now I'm going to go over to my index finger here, and I'm going to say, well, my index finger, the line is just below this middle one, and this line is about halfway between this middle one. So we're looking at a line below here and a line halfway to kind of line those ones up. So here's the rectangular piece for my index finger. Here's the rectangular piece for the second section of my index finger. And here's the curved section for my index finger. Now, it looks as though this is a little bit too short, so I'm going to go back and just change that. So I'm just kind of, again, making estimated rectangles around those sections. Now, the last finger we have is our pinky. And if you look closely at my pinkies, unfortunately, I have some weird genetic mutation where I have 4 creases on this finger, and I have 3 on this. I don't know why. I'm the only person that I've met with this kind of situation. So you can check your hands and text me or email me if you actually have the same thing. That would be interesting to know. But I'm going to, instead of drawing my 4 finger lines here to confuse you, I'm going to pretend that I have 3, since I think that's the vast majority of people have 3. And you can look, if I pretend that that's my finger, okay, you can look and see that my middle crease is about halfway between here, and my tallest crease is just above this piece here. So my tallest crease is here, my middle crease is about here, all right? And now if I make those rectangular sections, I've got one rectangular section here, a smaller rectangular section in the middle, and the pinky, the top section on me is kind of tall compared to the other ones. Okay, so there's my finished robot fingers. The last part is the thumb and or the last 2 parts, I guess, the thumb and the wrist. So if we look at our thumb, the thumb actually attaches to your hand right down here. And this bone for your thumb goes out this way, and here's my first joint. And then the next bone goes here, and here's my second joint, and then it goes out this way. So your bone structure looks more like that, and you can kind of see if you bend your thumb back and forth where those joints are. So a lot of people will just kind of draw the thumb kind of weirdly on the side sticking out. So what we want to do is closely observe and say, well, if the bone comes from here and goes out about this far, and then this bone comes up about like that, and then my other bone comes out like that, then we can start drawing those rectangular shapes. So the rectangular shape would come down to the end of my palm, and it starts about halfway up my palm this way. And that rectangular section is less of a rectangle, and it's more of a like trapezoid shape, like that. And it ends up creating this pad that's like right here, kind of curves over, and that rectangular section is more like that. Then this rectangular section actually is more like curves in here because that bone sticks out, at least on my fingers. It might look different on other people's, but my rectangular section kind of looks more, again, like a trapezoid, less of a rectangle and more a trapezoid, something like that. And then my last section is very curved because this pad part curves something like that. Okay, and so if you put that robot hand idea in there, it would be something more like that rather than just the kind of loopy thing that most people draw when they start drawing the idea of a hand. Now, the last section here is to look at our wrist. The wrist actually lines up with the edge of your hand on this side, and here the wrist actually lines up kind of with the inside of your pinky, like almost right here and here. So what I'm going to do is this section should come kind of curved out and down, and this kind of curves from here. You have the pad or the heel of your hand that actually curves out this direction and then curves back in to meet up with your pinky, kind of like this. Okay, and so this corner of our rectangle needs to get erased. Likewise, this curve comes in a little farther and then comes down like that. Okay, because it lines up more with this edge here. All right, so once you're there, you can erase this little rectangle and erase that little outside edge. Now, this is the finished product of our robot hand. On our robot hand, we were looking very closely at proportion. That's how one piece related or compared to another and getting the relative sizes correctly. And we also tried to do close observation, looking closely, comparing everything, and looking back and forth with our drawing. That's the final drawing for our session of the robot hand proportion drawing.